But when you look at nature, there is no garbage. So, and I think this is it's a wrong thinking. It's coming out of this linear stream, thinking that I make a raw material, I produce a good. After it's used, I throw it away.
Hello, hello. Welcome to the Good Garbage Podcast. My name is Ved Krishna. My primary reason for existence has been to find ways to leave our wonderful planet cleaner. We will be speaking with material innovators, creators, and propagators to learn from them how we can build for scale and towards a regenerative future. Their stories will help us answer the big question, what is good garbage? Hello, hello. Today we get to speak with Stefan Barot, the CEO of Biotec. Stefan has a rich background with biomaterials and has worked with larger organizations like BASF, Ciba Chemicals, and Purac before taking over the helm of Biotec. Biotec is a materials compounder that is based in Germany and is looking to understand various applications and provide numerous solutions. This is a really enriching conversation that digs deep into the bioplastic space. I'm sure you will enjoy the same. Hello, hello. Today we have Stefan Barot, the CEO of Biotec. Biotec is building numerous biopolymers, and the great thing is they're doing it at scale. And I'm very excited, Stefan, to talk to you. Thank you for being on the show.
The pleasure is all mine, Ved, and I'm really looking forward to an interesting conversation with you.
Thank you so much. Stefan, I'd love to hear more about your growing up years. I know you live in Germany now, but I have no clue where you grew up and what influences you had growing up that resulted in eventually, you leading this company that is trying to do so much good for the planet.
That's actually an interesting question. I never thought about that, but I'm originally from Switzerland, which is, of course, very nice from an environment point of view. And very early, I was concerned for the environment. I remember as a child walking through the forest and pick up garbage. And after I finished my studies, I actually joined on for a very large company, which is a chemical company in Switzerland, the environmental department. I have my own air cleaning device for 2 years. And then one of my bosses said, look, if you really want to do good something, then you have to go to production because that's where pollution is done. That's where you can actually prevent it. That's better than cleaning. And that's what I did. And that was a very interesting period. I then moved to Japan. I lived 7 years in Japan, 3 years in Korea, 3 years in China before I came back for a stint to Switzerland. Then went to the Middle East. And then back to Switzerland. And then I was in my mid-40s and said, hey, what I'm going to do now. And I decided to then join the bioplastic industry. Working first for PLA, at that time for Corbion or Total Energy Corbion. And then in 2020, I got the chance becoming CEO of Biotec. And basically the influence is, I had early on a concern. How can we improve? How can we improve the environment? How can we make it sustainable?
That's wonderful. And of course, I did not know about your Switzerland growing up and also all your international experience of Japan and Korea. I'm sure those would have had their own influences. I know that Japan, there's a lot of packaging. So I don't know if that impacted you when you were living in Japan.
Yeah, it's interesting because I went to clean riverbeds in Japan. I went to clean riverbeds in Korea. I mean, you're usually at a company day outing and you went out and collected the garbage, which your previous people had thrown away. And I think when I go to some of the countries now in Southeast Asia, this is a process of the society until people start to realize that actually nature belongs to everybody. And as everybody, you have to take care of it. If you don't do that, it's not going to work. And I think we see this on a much larger scale now because we all feel the impact of climate change now.
So you have a very, very rich background, of course, a degree in chemical engineering and then some really, really amazing companies because many of these I've worked with in terms of as a partner and as technology. I know Ciba really well, and of course BASF we had a lot of interesting interaction, especially with, I don't know if they, I'm sure you know their biopolymer EcoBio, and we used that early on, and I'm talking 10, 12 years back. We were trying to play with it and build different things in terms of paper and EcoBio. Would love to hear from you about your whole focus on chemical engineering, and then of course working with companies like BASF and SIBA, who are huge giants in the chemical space.
It certainly. I'm now the first time working for a family-owned company, which is very interesting. It's a complete different environment. It's very important. These large corporations are very important because they have only they in the end have the fund to really drive some basic research. And from that point of view, the biopolymer industry in Europe might have happened, but it was certainly really supported by BASF, by them pushing ahead in their EcoVio. And I mean, this is one of our suppliers. We are a compounder. We buy all kind of polymers, and I think there is not a supplier we don't know. And we are testing out where are the products different, what can we use, how can we create different functionalities with these different materials. And these large corporations, some of them are systemic. We see now what's happening in Germany with the high energy prices. And this is a challenge we have as a society, that we follow these principles, and capitalism is a good system, but somehow nature is not priced in, and that's a challenge we have there.
I love that thought process. And just from a more technical standpoint, your background says working in additivation services, especially when you're working for BASF. What does that mean, just for me and the listeners? What is additivation services?
I work when we look at it, first I worked for environmental services, then I worked for pharmaceutical production, pigments, and then I moved from the technical side to the commercial side, and I was then in plastic additives in Japan and in Korea. And what we did actually is we did a kind of what we do now. We made a compound, but not with polymers. But the traditional plastics, the fossil-based plastics, they need stabilization. They don't withstand heat, and they don't withstand ultraviolet light. Otherwise, they fragment. They lose functionality. And for that, you need additives. So we mix them together, allowing to dose in a granular form. And that meant you could be more precise, and you could also reduce your loading. So you could produce a better polymer in the end. And that's what additivation services was. And in this process, of course, you start to understand the process of your customer very well. And this is really important, that you understand how your customer is operating, what is important for him, because only then you can add value to him, and only then you can sell to him.
That's very interesting, because even when we play with different polymers, we realize exactly what you were saying, that it may be a good PLA and a polymer, but you put it in hot water and it'll start to bend, and then you have to work with different compounds to give it that rigidity.
I mean, polymers are very, very interesting materials, and I think the problem is that the current society, the relationship with plastics is trash, and that is the challenge we have right now. But in many solutions, when you look at it, plastic is the best option, because it's light, it's durable, it can hold for a very long time, it doesn't break. When you lose glass, I mean, we have customers who say, hey, we want to export something, we do it in glass right now, but so this percentage breaks on the way. And this is not good, not because the glass breaks, but you have produced a product for nothing, which is spoiled. And this is a challenge as well. We now lose, depending on the statistics, between 25 and 30% of all food is lost. And when you look at the greenhouse gas emissions because of the lost food, then you have to say it's much better to actually pack the food, even if you have the greenhouse gas emission because of the packaging, but that's less or it's less worse, or in other words, it's better for the environment.
You're so right. And I remember an early incident way back, and I was talking to one of the key people at General Mills, and this was maybe again 10, 12 years back, and we were trying to push the idea that they need to use our product, which was compostable, flexible packaging substrate. And he told me exactly the same thing. He said, "What is the dharma of packaging?" And he explained that it is ultimately to protect the products that are inside. If your product doesn't perform and I lose, say, a potato chip, um, what happens is, the potatoes are grown, they are transported, they've been put in cold storages, they've been sorted, they've used water, they have then been, using energy to build this. And I have lost that entire ecological impact, or created that. And we don't think about that. We are thinking about the final packet. So actually, you have to think about the whole cycle and the impact that it will have, not just the final product.
That is a very important part, because I see very often that we want to optimize a part and make it better. And it's like a balloon with air inside. You push somewhere, but then the problem goes somewhere else.
Yeah, it's systems thinking.
And this is the challenge we have to look. We need to really think in an integrated way. And I think we all know the current society we have is not sustainable. We all know that. It's not sustainable. And I'm really happy. I met once Sean Cleary. You can check him out. He's in the US, and he's the vice chair for the foundation of Future World Foundation. And he said, in order to be sustainable, a society must have three attributes. So first of all, it cannot take more resources than are available in the long term. Secondly, it needs to have the law. It needs to have a legal frame, because people who work hard, they want to have a benefit out of it. And thirdly, not everybody will be able to succeed in a system. In any system, there are always winners and losers, which means we need some philanthropy, or we need some social system. And the challenge we have globally is that out of two of these three, we are completely out of whack. We use way more resources than we can afford, and the philanthropy is not taken care of in large parts of the global society. And I think that the challenge we now have is that the third will start to wobble as well, because the environmental challenge we have will put a pressure on the legal system, because some of the laws, they don't work anymore. They are not adapted to the change of what is required to counter global warming.
You're so right, and it's such a fine balance. And of course, I want to get more into the ideas around what you said. Like, we sometimes get into plastic shaming, that plastic is bad, but you're right, plastic is actually a wonder material. The challenge is that we don't know how to dispose it, and we don't know how to have an end of use or end of life. And of course, that's where your work goes. And but before I step into that, one little piece that is missing in our conversation so far is your time that you entered Purac. And then that seems to be the time when you started working with PLA and bioplastics. So tell me more about how that happened and that journey. And of course, that then will lead us well into biotech.
I think the challenge for the biopolymer industry is a very young industry in a sense. It's actually interesting that biopolymers by themselves, they're pretty old. I mean, the lactic acid, PLA, came in the 1965 or whatever. It's quite an old molecule. But until there was an advantage in it, that people saw that you can do something with it, it took quite a while. And with others, with PHA, they also exist quite a long time already. But we have this challenge now. How do we get to economy of scale in the whole polymer industry? And what do you do when you start a new industry? You look, where are the experts? And for the polymer industry, the experts, they come from the chemical and the fossil-based industry. So coming from there, it was quite natural to settle in the polylactic acid. And then it took a time until we got the model right, and we decided to build an own plant, because we had a different business model. And for 3-4 years, after 3-4 years, we realized ain't gonna work that way, which was an interesting learning experience. You cannot work against the market at large. It's not going to work. So for me personally, that was an interesting one. If the market has a certain structure, if you don't fit into this structure as a newcomer, it will not work.
When you say that, are you thinking about the supply chain? Like it has to work on the same machines, or are you thinking something else? Just love for you to elaborate.
When you look at it, you have prime polymer producers, you have compounders, you have converters. Why is a prime polymer producer not forward integrating into compounding and into converting? I mean, some of course do for very large compounds, but that's not. It's a bad combination. First of all, you compete with your own customers, and secondly, a large company has a complete different horizon, investment horizon, because these large plants, they are planned for 10, 20 years. That's the business horizon. A compounder, the business is much, much faster. You have to react much, much faster. The swings are much bigger and faster. And the product you make, you make a compound. If a customer wants a change, you make this in 2 weeks. As long as it's okay from your certification point of view, you have some balance there, you make him a new product. You cannot do that as a large corporation, which was, of course, clear. If you make a new chemical, that's all the background checks and whatever you have to do. And these are the differences of the different value chain and why it's a challenge sometimes to go forward or go backward in the value chain.
This is something very interesting that you brought up, and I keep thinking about that when we disrupt, it's really important to not try and disrupt everything. So because it doesn't work, and exactly what you're saying, there's a certain supply chain that has come into being. Like what you said, there is people who produce the molecule, there are people who produce the base substance like lactic acid or polymerized lactic acid. Then there are compounders. Then there is somebody who's taking that plasticizer or the pellet and making a blow film from it. And then there is somebody who may be printing and pouching it. So there's a whole chain that is there. And why do you think that is the case? Why do you think that disruption should not take place in the entire thing? And some of it you mentioned in terms of there is a certain speed for different things. But then, don't you think sometimes you just do need to disrupt the whole supply chain? Or what is your thought there?
I think the disruption needs to happen, and it will happen, but we still need certain part of these value chains. I mean, when we now look at what we have to do overall, it's not about the plastic pollution; it's about greenhouse gas reduction. That is the big challenge we have. How can we prevent global warming to the extent possible? Because if the South Pole melts, the seawater level is going to rise by 60 meter. And that means a large part of the inhabitable and fertile land is simply gone. Despite the fact that then it's probably so hot, we have several places where you cannot live anymore. But that's the big part. It's not the plastic pollution. The big problem we have. The big problem is global warming. And then the question is, okay, what can we do and where are bioplastic actually help to reduce this global warming? That's, I think, the question we need to ask ourselves. And when we look into where global warming is coming from, then yes, we have roughly 41,000 billion tons of organic carbon on the planet, and 38,000 billion tons are in the sea, and 710 are in the air, and 2,000 in the biomass on land, and 10 billion tons are actually what we emit as human beings. So it's not a lot when you look at the total balance. It's not a lot. So it shows how, I wouldn't know fragile, but how easily this system can be disturbed. And the challenge we have is that society rests on two pillars. On energy, beside the law, on energy and on food. Because if one of the two is missing, you have a revolution. Now, we can decarbonize the energy production, but we cannot decarbonize the material streams. That's not possible. Because the carbon is in the clothes. It's in the computer you look at, the carbon is there. We can only defossilize that. So we can make the energy with solar and wind. There we can decarbonize. But the material stream will still be carbon-based to a large extent. And the other challenge is that actually the two, the energy and the material streams, they are linked together. They are linked because every product, when it's produced, needs energy. And the question will be, which carbon sources are we using if we want to defossilize? So which organic carbon sources are we using if we want to defossilize the material stream? And the question there is then, how much energy do we need for this preparation? Because we will have a certain competition with food feed, which, by the way, when you believe at the studies, even if we would swing, which we cannot, all the plastics, the 400 million tons, to bio-based, we would need something like 2 to 5%, depending on which studies I look, of the agricultural area. But the question is, where is it coming from and how much energy do we need? We can use waste materials, but the waste materials will need considerably more energy to bring them to a level where you can use these materials. So it's really a very complex puzzle we have here.
You've actually touched on two very interesting points. One is, of course, the defossilization. And that's something that is a debate that's ongoing, that because I know of a lot of materials, and I'm sure you know even better than me, on materials that can be biodegradable and compostable. It could be the PBSs, PBATs of the world, and of course others, PVOH, PVA, that whole spectrum. But you haven't still defossilized. You're still using a petroleum base, and that's what you're saying. The second, even more interesting part that you've said is, how are we processing it? Which is like, are we consuming, like, exactly again what you dwelled on, is that, are we consuming a lot of energy from fossils to create something? So that's two very interesting ideas. I'm going to focus on the first one a little more, because I think it's important for all of us to realize what you're saying is defossilization. So it's not just about creating compostable or biodegradable products. You should move away from a fossil-based raw material.
Yes.
Can you elaborate a little more for enhancing the understanding of us as listeners on why that is important?
Sure. When we talk about the bioplastics, as you say, you have a front end and you have a back end, if you say. So bioplastics can be bio-based, and it can be biodegradable, and it can be both. Now we need a bit to explain deeper what that means. So in a bio-based bioplastic, it can be exactly the same plastic like a fossil-based one. So bio-based polyethylene versus fossil-based polyethylene. But the carbon is coming from biosource. So it's coming from sugar or starch or a waste material, which means when you incinerate it, you give it back to nature. So you're not releasing fossil-based carbon, which has been stored for millions of years, or coal or whatever it is, in the ground. And that, of course, means, yes, you still have an emission because you need to process, but when you release the carbon, it's green carbon, we can say. The other one is the end-of-life story, and the end-of-life story is, why should something compost in the end? I mean, we talk about biodegradation, but I don't like this term. I use it very often, but I don't like it because it's not a defined term. Anything is biodegradable. It's always a question of conditions and time. So even a car, in a sense, is biodegradable. It might just take hundreds of years until it biodegrades. So then the question is, when does biodegradation really make sense? And biodegradation makes sense from our point of view in 2.5 or 3 cases broadly. So first of all, when you transport a lot of waste biomass to a waste biomass treatment facility. So then we talk about a composting plant, or we talk about an anaerobic digestion plant. It makes sense, compostable or biodegradable. We can later on talk a bit the different options. plastics make sense if they are purposely put in nature, because then we will not have microplastics. So mulch film is an example. Geotextiles are an example. And we can later on talk the problem we have with microplastics. And the third one is there are several items which are very difficult to collect or prone to littering. Then we can discuss, does it make sense? But when we look at that, this is posing a completely new aspect of material design. Because we now have to, when we design an article, we have to answer three questions. So what functionality do I need to provide? And this is what we discussed in the beginning. If you have a food packaging, it must protect the food. Otherwise, you don't have the functionality. How do I want to convert it? I mean, do I want to blow a film? Do I want that thermoform? Do I have injection molding? That was here as well with fossil-based and non-degradable materials, so with the traditional materials. But what's coming in new now is how do we keep in this product in the loop for as long as possible, and where does it go out in the end? And there are a lot of people think that mechanical recycling is the key. It's important, but it will not solve the problem overall, because you cannot keep it by mechanical recycling in the loop forever. It will not work. For reasons of cross-contaminations with other plastics, and for reasons of chain scission, so the molecular chains, they will be cut with every thermal or mechanical process. So we already need to ask ourselves, okay, where is the material then going out in the end? And you actually have only two options. It's very simple. Either you let nature do it, or do you let chemistry do it? And then we are at the point where it's organic recycling, so biodegradation, composting, biogas facilities, or it's going to be chemical recycling. And these are the two options which we have in the end.
That's amazingly.
Sorry, it was rather a long
No. This is so good. I've of course, spent most of my life, trying to understand this. The way you put it is so succinct, in the end. And what is very important, what you actually drive on, is it has to, in the end, get out of the system. There is only that many loops that you can do. And like you say, ultimately, we can talk all about recycling, downcycling, etc. But there has to be a point when it has to get out of the system, any material. And how does it get out is the question. And what you're saying is that, either it's nature or it's chemistry. So, and that's very
unless of course we talk about the three linear options. And the three linear options are you basically waste it, you litter, one option, which is unacceptable. You landfill, which is, from my point of view, also not a long-term option, or you incinerate, which is the least worst option, but it's also not really sustainable.
Oh, that's amazing. That's really, really succinctly put. And I'm going to come back to the second part of my earlier question, which is the process. And this also is very interesting for me. And I would love to get your perspective on it, because many times we talk about even recycling. And sometimes I see the amount of impact that recycling has is way higher than a virgin material. Because, you're going to transport it across the world, you're going to take it inland, you're going to then process it, recover maybe only 50% of it, using 60 or 70% of the energy of the original. And that's a huge impact. How do you see that part, the processing energy from a fossil fuel probably used to process something which may not be fossil-based?
I think, Ved, I think you're absolutely right there. Again, it's a question to look at the total system. We can talk about an LCA, their life cycle analysis, but I think it's irresponsible from the Western countries to export plastic waste in the hope that that will be properly processed at another place. I think this is not fair. We need to solve the problems we create here by our own means. My personal view. And it doesn't make sense, but it's to export it, and you're absolutely right. We need to see what is the energy or the environmental damage in the end we do when we look in another place if we concentrate these materials. And this is always the problem we have, and that's economy of scale. Because you need a certain economy of scale to economically recycle something, to sort something. And how much is now the concentration of this material in the end? How much energy or environmental damage you do in this concentration? That's exactly the question. Which also means that in an urban and a rural setting, you might not have the same solution. Because when we look at it, you have home composting potentially in a rural setting. The challenge will be that if you don't do home composting right, you actually make it worse, because you have more greenhouse gas emissions than you would have if you do it centrally and if you concentrate the material. I mean, the first studies now come out to show that this has an impact. And I think the challenge we have as society is that this is so complex that nobody really knows all the leverages, and it's a constantly moving part. We now try to do a recycling calculation. I'm pretty close in biotech, which I gave one of my youngsters and said, please try to calculate once if we come in with a polymer stream and we lose, we can now use polyethylene, we lose 10% as an example in the collection already. Then we have to separate it. If it all goes into one bag, you lose again material. How much in the end can we use, and how long can it be in the cycle, and how would these streams in the end look like? Because I think that's one of the very big challenges we have now. We all know the system we have is not sustainable. And nobody wants to, everybody says, I'm moving, but I don't want to give my standard of living. But nobody has shown a system where we can keep more or less our standard of living. I mean, everybody's willing to change to a certain extent, where it would work. I've seen nobody, no politician, no scientist to say this could be the system of the future and it would work.
Yeah, and we are used to our conveniences, you're right. And, like it's a little shift is okay. Somebody can carry a water bottle instead of buying one, or a bag. But if you talk about a larger shift of eating habits, for example, that will become a challenge.
I mean, you know Einstein saying, Einstein said you cannot solve the problems which technologies that created them.
So interesting.
If this is very frightening, because if we, and we are both technically educated people, if the technical people do not come up with a solution, the alternative is a dictatorship.
Yeah.
Because that's the only way to dictate the people. That's the way how you have to live. Otherwise, we will not survive, and that's pretty frightening.
Yeah, it's the rule of the law. Then that is the only way it will work.
And then you would have to say, no, you're not allowed to travel anymore. You have one travel for pleasure every year, not more.
Yeah, yeah.
Or you cannot buy, there's no more McDonald's of fast food because it's too much littering, or whatever it is. I mean, I don't want to pinpoint now one company is worse or better than the other, not at all, please. But I think it's important to understand that then you have to come with very hard-nosed rules.
Yeah. So actually, what you're saying is the pressure is on people like us to come up with biomaterials that can actually provide the alternates. Otherwise, at some point, that will be the case. And one more thing I want to point out before starting to dig into what we do in terms of biomaterials. But one more thing that you talked about a little bit, and what came to my mind, was your thinking on it being a holistic system. So even when we think about composting, one of the challenges that we face is the way we use land. If you're going to pump in a lot of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, etc., on it, there is never enough of a market for compost. And that again builds it into this system that, okay, you can create a compostable material, but there is no market. People are not buying. And hence you're left with, home compost you can put in your garden.
Yeah.
But, a centralized composting facility also needs that systems thinking that there has to be a market for compost. And that's a challenge.
But that is a fundamental question, how you look at garbage. I mean, there are many studies which have shown that if you have biomass waste, And you can look at what I'm going to do with this biomass waste. So you say landfilling is not okay and the littering is not okay. You can talk about the incineration. You can talk about composting. You can talk about anaerobic digestion. Let's once leave the bioplastic out, which actually helps to collect more. And all the studies have shown that anaerobic digestion is the cheapest option. There is a study in Switzerland, there is a study in the UK, which say anaerobic digestion is the cheapest solution. Why? Because it generates energy, it generates compost, and with the compost we do two things. First of all, we replace fossil-based fossil-based fertilizers, and secondly, we bind carbon to the soil. And all the studies show with compost, you enrich biodiversity, which is one of the big challenges now. We have this decrease in biodiversity, which we don't know exactly how it will impact us, but it could lead to an economical and environmental collapse in the end if we have that the biodiversity is too low. So we need to look into that. And when we look in Europe, why Italy, for example, or why Spain, why France are so much more advanced in compostable materials and compostable bioplastics as well, it is for two reasons. First of all, Germany invested into incinerations a long time ago, but the much bigger impact is Germany has, to a large extent, enough carbon in the soil. They don't need it. In the south, it's missing. So the farmers want the compost. It's a political drive there.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
So again, when we look at the driving forces, why something is happening there, it's usually very, very logical. But what the West should do, or when we look at it, we know that at least 5% of global greenhouse gases are coming of not managed waste dumps. So in Thailand, because I have the figure there, again, I don't want to pinpoint back to Thailand because it's the same in the Philippines and in Indonesia and so on, also in India. 50% in Thailand of the waste, the biomass waste, is not managed. It's just dumped somewhere, together with the plastic. And 5% of greenhouse gases are emitting from this. We have the technical solution how to do that. It costs money, but we have the technical solution. And from the same dump is the plastic in the ocean. I mean, from Japan, from the States, from Europe, of course there is some plastic leakage, but it's very minimal. And we have to try to further reduce it, yes, but if we want to do really good, we have to support the nations who don't have the financial means to do it. Then we can really do something.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I grew up in India and we saw exactly what you said. That They were land dumps, not landfills. There was leachate going down into the soil. There was methane going up into the air. There was, things lighting up and, huge fires. And of course, the kind of bacterial growth and the damage to human society in terms of disease and people who are working there. We call them rag pickers, trying to get some economic value out of that. People falling and dying in the dump. Medical waste being put in the same dump. It's a horrendous sight.
It's mind-boggling. And I think the rag pickers, I understand in India there is a lot of pressure from the rag pickers. But if we would take the biomass waste out first and say the rest can be picked by the rag pickers, it actually would be much easier for them.
Oh, for sure.
Much cleaner.
And it's interesting, the data for the West, it is 70% dry and 30% wet is the typical ratio of garbage. In places like India, it is reverse. It's 70% wet and 30% dry because the consumption levels are different. And you're right, we are even losing so much economic value because if you could do anaerobic digestion, you get energy and you get compost. And of course, you remove a lot of organics from the cycle. but then somebody has to be able to separate those two, just dry and wet, even if we are able to do that separation at the source.
When I get a lot the comment in Germany, yeah, but people cannot separate. And I always have to say, if you can explain in Italian how to separate, you should also be able to explain in German how to separate. And I think this is possible. We just have to make it easy for the people. And this is by technology, especially in India, this is possible. You have internet everywhere now. Most people have a mobile phone. You could have a QR code on every article to say goes in bin A, it goes in bin B, or it goes in bin C, which would have the additional advantage that in one part of the country, the same article might go in bin A and in other in the bin B, because the end-of-life system is not the same. I did a quick calculation for the state North Rhine-Westphalia, where I'm based now in Germany. And they are collecting roughly 2 million tons of biomass waste every year. That's just the statistics. Now, if you would consequently put that into an anaerobic digestion, and again, this is on some assumptions of a comparable plant, which I had. I don't know exactly the mix, which is from North Rhine-Westphalia. But if you look at that, you would create or you would save about 800,000 tons of CO2 emissions. And I'm very happy if I find somebody who is challenging me on this calculation, who helps me to improve. Because even if it's only 500,000, but the calculation is good, Europe has 100 million tons of biomass waste. So we need to see how we can collect that and use it. And the largest part is the replacement of fossil-based fertilizers. That's the largest part. That's about half in this calculation.
Yeah, I remember trekking in Nepal, and I don't know if you've ever done that, but Nepal somehow created these village sewage systems which were generating biogas. All their food was coming from the methane from just the toilets. Like, so there were these small, little incineration plants.
Yeah.
Wow, this
It
is
doesn't need to be
amazing.
complicated.
Yeah, it was pretty simple.
But then we need to create solutions which fit into that.
Yeah, and they were just piping it to their kitchen, and they were fine.
Yeah.
Nobody had any issues of taking methane from the toilet, but it was really well. Firing the. I thought it was such a genius system.
I was in India, to give you another example, and when I was in my previous company, and we wanted to see how PLA works in the methanization. Can we pre-treat it to make it work in a mesophilic system, so a system that works roughly at body temperature? And we looked for a metalworking company who had a canteen. They had like, I think 80 workers or something like that, and they offered them a meal. And they had between 5 and 10 kilograms of food waste a day, so 3 meals, and they worked in shifts. And we put this into this biogas reactor. And it created so much biogas that they could cook with it. And then there was enough that even the house of the owner could cook with it. And then there was still left to do something with it. So if we take our minds to it, there is a lot of optimization possible.
The Good Garbage podcast has been brought to you by Pakka. Pakka has been creating solutions in the food packaging, carry, and service space. Pakka utilizes sugarcane residue and upcycles it into amazing products. Their latest offering is a compostable, flexible packaging solution for the chocolate and confectionery industry. The products are available in the Indian subcontinent and in North America now. Pakka is also building an end-to-end solutions for customers in the food service and delivery space. For any query, do email at connect@pakka.com, and Pakka is Pakka. Now, back to the show. Yeah, so coming back to our conversation, the one very interesting thing you said, and I had no clue about this, and this will pivot us well towards materials, which is something that I'm very interested in learning from you on the biotech side. You actually told me that PLA was actually created in 1965. I had no clue about this. So can you tell us a little more about the history of lactic acid and polymerization of lactic acid, how that happened and when that happened?
That was my previous job, huh? So I also want to say a bit about biotech in the end. But no, I mean, PLA is one of the very promising biopolymers, compostable biopolymers, because it has a very good yield. So theoretically, you can go in with 1.2 kilogram of sugar if you would have a 100% yield to make PLA. Practically, probably not going to reach that. We are now at, whenever you look, between 1.4 and 1.6. That's when you read the history. But the interesting thing is as well that this is a production technology which is very close to traditional polymers. So you make the lactic acid, you make the lactite, and you make the PLA. The lactic acid is difficult to scale because you come from a biological process, so from a biomaterial, and then you need to make a chemical molecule, a defined chemical molecule out of it. But once you have this, after that you can scale the process. And that means you can make it big, and when you make it big, it becomes cheap. And the possibility there is that when plants get large, you come very close to the traditional fossil-based plastic. And that would allow a very large replacement of the polymers, traditional polymers. An additional advantage is that when we talk about compostable materials, they're all polyesters. So all carbon, oxygen, carbon bonds. When you look at polyethylene, polypropylene, they are carbon-carbon bonds. The parts in polyethylene are also much smaller, the molecular weight. Lactic acid is a rather large molecule, which means you have less bonds. This means if you do chemical recycling, a PLA is much, much easier. You need less than 10% of the energy than you need for a polyethylene, which means really the chemical recycling of bringing it back to lactic acid and repolymerizing, and then you have really a stream which is almost endless. So what we said before, it needs to go out somewhere, then you have something which is really possible almost forever. There are some snacks there as well you have to look at. But in principle, if you would use a PET bottle, or then a PLA bottle, you bring it back after it's scratched and whatever, and you make lactic acid and then PLA out again, you have something which is, beside the energy from a material flow, 100% recyclable. 100% in a loop.
Oh, that's very interesting, because but then that also adds the complexity that just now we were just talking earlier, that separation of materials, and we were talking about separating just dry and wet. And if we want to separate PLA from a petroleum-based plastic, that'll be a further challenge, and of course that'll create its own complications.
Actually, technically, that's very easy. This can be done. This has all been proven. Again, the challenge is the logistics behind it and the mass. So in Europe, I don't know about the States, but in Europe, you need like 10 to 15,000 tons of one material for sorting plant to make it economically viable to sort that material out. Otherwise, it's not happening. There is no separation channel for this polymer. But I think this is also a question we need to ask ourselves. Is it meaningful to throw everything in one bin and then separate it again? Is this meaningful? Or should we see that we make closed loops? And closed loops, in a way, what we have in Europe with the PET bottles, I pay 20 cents if I buy the bottle. If I give the bottle back, I give my 20 cents back. I get my 20 cents back, and then I bring my bottle back. The challenge we then have is that the whole retail system is not built for that, because they would need much more space to store waste materials. And in the US, where you have large outside retailers, that might work, but in Europe, where the space sometimes is more constrained, that's a real challenge. So again, it has many more implications on the system, where we have to think, what is now cheaper? We actually need more land. We have to heat these facilities, you have to build them. Or are we really putting everything in one bin and then taking it apart again? And these are the thinking processes as a society we have to go through.
Yeah, Stefan, you have so much insight into the systems thinking that I think we might need to do an entire episode on just that. So I'm going to make a switch because
I'm
otherwise,
happy to do that. Yes.
yeah, otherwise we don't get to biotech so much. So I love the journey that you had in terms of traditional materials and then getting into Purac and PLAs and then biotech. So let's move to biotech, and of course that's something that we want to learn
Yeah.
about in terms of tell us more about how that journey happened and how what does biotech do and why did it attract you?
Happily. So we are actually this year 32 years old. We are one of the oldest, I think the second oldest bioplastic compounder. From the start, we are only producing compostable solutions. We have some durable ones, but they are based on compostable solutions. And that, what I said before is really what we try to live. I mean, we try to discuss with a customer and say, okay, what do you really try to achieve? How do you want to convert it? And what's your desired end of life solution? And this is a standard process for new customers we go through. And sometimes we have to tell them, look, we cannot offer you the right solution. You better go to somebody else. What we do since a long time, and a large part of our business is in flexibles, because that's where the biggest problem with pollution is. They're very light, they're easily, with the wind, transported for littering. And there we are the only company who can use starch directly. I mean, other companies also use starch, but we use it directly and without the plasticizer, which has, like everything, pros and cons. But we have home compostable solutions since a long time. We have soil degradable solutions, of course, industrially compostable solutions, solutions that work in anaerobic digestion. And that's what we do. That's why we are so interested in the total solution. And we're not just in, okay, we make it bio-based. We also have solutions that go up to 65% bio-based. We're now trying to shoot for an 80% bio-based solution. And it's really important that we look at the total system. Again, where is the material coming from? What do we try to do with it? And in Europe, some states are pretty far advanced with bio-based bags, for example. It's very simple, but in Italy, for example, when you go to a shopping market, all the bags are compostable. So you get your food back and you use the same in a bag, in these sleeve bags, and you put the food waste in there and you make a knot and you put this into the bin. So this is well thought through. In Spain, same. And from that point of view, it looks like an easy product. It's not. Like everything from far away, it looks easy, but it's actually not.
And I'm sure it's not. But before we get there, what you mentioned again is fascinating, that it's been around for 32 years. So tell us more about the genesis of biotech. How did it happen? Who was your founder? And why did they think about getting into the bioplastics or biopolymer domain when it wasn't that? Now, today everybody talks about it, but it wasn't possibly that in 32 years back. How did that happen?
Again, we actually founded by Melita, which is a large German brand, still in the packaging industry, actually a competitor of our mother company now. They belong to Sphere. Then we had various owners, and since 15 years or 17 years, we now belong to a French company, which is Sphere. And they're in France and Spain and Italy, one of the largest producer then of the bags. So they use our compounds to make compostable bags. They also make different products, but they are 800 million euro company with 1,700 people, 15 production facilities all over Europe. And we are selling half of our products to them and half of our products to other companies outside.
So that's a great backward integration. And in a way, what we were talking about way earlier, disruption of the supply chain, you go backward and create your own stream of materials by having a compounding company within your
Yeah.
fold. But what attracted you to them? Of course, you had a wide career and experience.
Now I'm after, let's say, 40 years, now 40 years is maybe too much, but 35 years in the large companies. I thought it would be very interesting, and it is very interesting, once to look at a smaller company and also a different industry in the sense. I was in biopolymers before, but here in a compounder you can make decisions much, much faster. You can move faster. You have to move faster in the end. I mean, I have been thrown at with this COVID at problems we never thought they would be possible, like you probably as well. But it's fun because you can show results much faster. In a large corporation, when you make PLA until the plant is operational, I mean, this is 3-4 years process until you're there. To buy a new compounder, to invest, to act is much, much faster in our case, and that's what fascinated me.
Yeah. So let's talk a little more about the products that biotech is doing. What is the base compound that you're utilizing? And of course, you already mentioned that there's a variety of products that you do in the end. But in terms of the raw materials, what is the main focus? Is there a focus that, I'm going to take this base material and make my own, recipe within that? How does that work?
I mean, again, we have started 30 years ago, so we have different. I mean, when you look at a product, you need some performance, mechanical performance, and that means you can get this with the different raw materials and with the screw design of the compounder in the end. So we have a lot of knowledge in how to set up the screw design and which raw materials to use, because you can buy a PLA from one producer or from the other producer. It's not exactly the same. You can produce a starch from one supplier and the other supplier. It's not exactly the same. Same for PBAT, for PHA, for PBS. I mean, we use all the materials, and for that we have experts in-house who basically say, okay, if you want to make this performance, this conversion, this end of life, that's roughly the product we have to start with. And then in some cases we already have a product which we just either can use or can tweak, and sometimes we really have to do something completely new.
So you also talk about in your website, which is very interesting because I've heard all the other things, but GMO free. And one is, why is that important for you? And the second is, how do you really determine that? Because, if you're buying PLA, then would the PLA supplier have to certify that it's GMO free, the corn was GMO free? And why is that so important for you?
Maybe in the US, again, this is completely different. In the US, you have learned to live with GMO. But here in Europe, especially in the Nordic countries, GMO is like you don't even have to say none or free. As soon as they hear GMO, certain people just shut down. GMO is bad. So it is an advantage to say we have no GMO there. So genetically modified organisms, or in the end food. And especially in the Nordic countries, it was a very long time a bashing subject of some NGOs who said we don't want GMO food, we don't want. The verdict is still out there, because I think the US has shown that this is actually not a real problem. We have no higher cancer rates in the US because of GMO corn. And it's a question in as well, when I look at it in the past, how did you create a new variety of apples or whatever? Yeah, you had an apple seed and you used a very strong radiation, and then some of them died and the others get old and other get. Is that better? But that was accepted at that time. So it's a bit bizarre for me as well. But for some of our customers, this is very important, that we have non-GMO, and yes, we get this certified. We use the starch here very clearly. Most of our starch is coming from potatoes here. And the PLA, certain customers certify, or certain suppliers certify to you that is GMO free.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I understand now that it's a European thought process as well, because we thought, that's very interesting that you have so much focus on it. And you're right, in terms of electrons activation, there are so many materials that are transported across the world, and they activate the electrons just so that it stays longer.
Yeah.
And we don't know that they go through radiation chambers, and, even the pulses that you get from across the world, etc. And nobody talks about that. But coming back to what you were talking about in
Yeah.
terms of understanding the customer and then compounding the right mix for them,
Yeah.
seem to have a lot of products and there's a lot of offering. And of course, you mentioned there are also some rigids and there are some
Yeah.
flexibles.
Yeah.
Is there a certain focus that I'm going to focus on? It is very clear that you focus on defossilized raw material. And then, of course,
Yes.
there is a focus on packaging and in general that kind of domain.
Yeah.
So how do you determine that this is what biotech will do and this is what biotech will not do? Are there things which are clear in terms of the business idea?
And I mean, Ved, you know that life is all about choices. It's the same for a company, yeah? And we have a large portfolio with like 60 projects. We work on a few of them because some of them are ideas. Others are customer requests where we say, okay, should we do that? Should we not do it? I mean, if it's a simple product which you can take and say, maybe that's working, let's see. You give it to the customer after really understanding what he wants. But then it's all about choices. So you need to look into, okay, is this just a product adaptation? Is it something completely new? How big is the market? How big is the technical gap? Do we already have an established raw material base? Do we have an established supply chain in the end on the sales channel? I would say that's the right word. And these are all factors that have to flow into the decision on which products and projects are we focusing. But it's very interesting what sometimes people come up with as ideas. Huh? When you look at it, if you really start to dig down why they would like to have something, what is their true motivation, what's the problem is, then you see some very interesting trends as well.
Yeah, that's true. And those are easier. It's only when you get into the intricacies of, like you said, is the raw material available? Is there enough of a supply chain? Does it work? Those are the things where it starts to get complex. So that leads me well to, there are so many biopolymers coming in. We were both at Rethinking Materials. Everything was seaweed. There's so much seaweed-based polymer. The other one, which we have been very, very interested and excited about, and you mentioned it, was the PHA kind of domain.
Yeah. Yeah.
So with your wide understanding of biopolymers, what are you most excited about and what do you think is going to build up in the future? Because also we all know that we need scale. So in terms of scale and performance, what is the domain that excites you most?
And maybe we can close the circle with that. I mean, when I look where I would like to be in 2050 or where I hope that we are in 2050, I hope that by 2050, 50% of the carbon in all polymers is bio-based, and that's where where compostability makes sense. Products are compostable, truly compostable. And when we then look into what products really make sense, then we have to say, hey, diapers, female hygiene, that should all be compostable. When you look into this scenario, technically this is all possible. It would be even possible now, maybe not with the same convenience, but it would be possible. When you then look what polymers are required for that, to a large extent we already have them. What we do not have is maybe the exact performance. We can improve. And you know polymers as I do, it's a lot about the glass transition temperature. It's a lot about under which, and for the viewers, under a glass transition temperatures, the molecules cannot move anymore. They're frozen. So you have a rigid material. Above, you get a flexible material. Above, also, the degradation happens. The composting happens. But this really is driving the performance, the glass transition temperature, beside the rigidity and the processability. So I think we will see many more copolymers coming out. I think there are also some new polymers which are fossil-based now, which work in the degradation process, which will be more and more changed to bio-based carbon. I mean, PBAT, the B part and the A part, you can relatively easily make compostable. Bio-based, can make bio-based. The terephthalic acid is a bigger challenge, but you could replace the terephthalic acid by another molecule which is bulky. You need that for the crystallinity and apart from a polymer structure. So when you look at that, there will still be a lot of development technically happen. I think what we also see is that we will get larger and larger plants, so that actually the costs start to come down of these products. We had a roller coaster. I don't know whether you saw that in the US. We had the PLA going from $2 to $4. Now it's at $2 again, maybe a bit more. The PBAT went from 2 to 4. Now it's below 2. And I think this will happen because it will be an imbalance. So you have not enough supply because a new law is enacted, and then the prices shoot up, and then you cannot implement the law, and then more capacity is built, and so on. This will happen, which is also a legal challenge. I mean, we really need to talk with the policymakers to tell them we support what you want to do, but please do it gradually, because if you do everything in one go, it will not work. We don't have enough supply. There is no way we can build 10 million tons overnight. It won't work. And that means a law is not credible because it cannot be implemented. Yeah. But yes, it excites me to see that more and more of the industry is now starting to move. We start to realize that bio-based and biodegradable, compostable plastics really play a good and positive role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
So just quickly, in terms of the customers and the market, how do you see as adaptability when you come to biotech? Are you seeing a huge shift in terms of people wanting materials from biotech? And also in terms of cost, do you run into that a lot, or are you able to have these conversations more easily now as things are progressing?
Again, I think it depends a bit on the market, but also the application. Whenever you do a survey, and we did some, but we also look at others, people are very positively towards bioplastics. They very often don't understand what they're talking about, but they are very positive towards it. If you explain it to them, they are still positive. I think the challenge is more on the legal side. How do you mandate it? How do you communicate it? I don't know, have you ever stood in front of a bin when you were in a railway station or airport or whatever, and you have recycling, non-recycling, and whatever? Look once at the people. People don't know what to put where. They put it random. There is a very nice cartoon where you have 3 bins, recyclable, not recyclable, and your guess is as good as mine, and your guess is good as mine is completely overflowing. So we have a communication problem there. But people are very positive towards bioplastics, compostable and bio-based one. I think we still need to work as an industry together with the lawyers on the clear signalization, on the communication. When is and what can you do with it, and when it's meaningful and when it's not meaningful. I mean, when we talk about a compostable shoe, nobody would make a compostable shoe. It doesn't make sense. A bio-based shoe, yes, that makes a lot of sense, but a compostable shoe doesn't make sense. So I think we still need to look into in which applications is it really meaningful to have compostable products. And I think there we should be a bit more pragmatic as politicians We should actually say if the food waste to packaging ratio is higher than a certain factor 2, factor 3, we can discuss what it is, then it should be mandatory to be compostable. Otherwise, it should go into the recycling, mechanical recycling and then chemical recycling stream. And then, of course, there will always be exception unless you can prove that for a certain application, it's better to do it in a different way.
Looking at biotech, I see it as scaled provider of solutions. So you're already at 60,000 tons. You talk about being 100,000. How do you see if you are to look into the future, say 10 years, or maybe let's take a shorter term, maybe 5 years down? How do you see biotech scaling, and what do you see as the most promising areas for biotech in growth in the next 5 years?
We will certainly continue to grow. We are growing now, even in a very difficult environment, because the market, in fact, is actually shrinking in Europe right now. It's not growing, which is for me temporary. It will pick up again in the future. The reason for the shrinkage is that people have less money. We see it because of inflation. So where are we going to be? Where are we going to focus? Well, we focus on those applications which the customer want, and or where regulation is going to come in. And we see that certain parts will be favored in the future. I mean, for example, biomass waste as of next year has to be collected separately. As of 2027, you're no longer allowed to incinerate biomass waste. How long then the countries will need to implement it is another question. But legally, actually by European Union, that will be the law, or is the law. So this will create an additional demand. We also see that more and more food is grown in greenhouses, because you can harvest throughout the year. You're not, India, and it's millions of tons of tomatoes, and the third is thrown away because all is ripening at the same time. So it's cheaper to produce that way, but it's not good for the farmers because they cannot compete with the price they get. So, or they cannot survive with the price they get. So it would actually be better to work in greenhouses and try to smoothen out production. And there we have solutions as well to actually help with bioplastics and make it easier to turn around. So on such applications, we will focus in the future.
That's wonderful, and I'm sure the as you said, this is a temporary lull, and I'm sure the growth will be there, and the impact that you're creating will continue in terms of scale, and the markets might diversify. You might sell more in Asia and places like that, but I'm sure the growth will continue. And of course, I'm very, very excited about what you're going to answer to my most the final question that I always ask, and with a succinct chain of thought, what do you think is good garbage?
If you want me to answer in one answer, and I think first of all you do a wonderful job. I think it's really great what you do. That you allow people to provide a platform. You have this discussion. I think this is fabulous. When I first thought about it, it's wrong. There shouldn't be garbage. Every garbage is a raw material. That's when I thought a bit, when you first said, what is good garbage, when I first thought about it until I realized what you were doing. But I think you do a great job in providing a platform, trying to collect the opinions, allowing other people to listen in, to share their opinion and picking up more know-how. So I think it's great what you do. So congratulations that you enable this.
Thank you so much. That's very kind of you. And what I get, I was expecting a more detailed kind of explanation of good garbage, but what I get is basically there is no such thing. There should not be any such thing as garbage.
Exactly. I think it's a definition we did. We make as humans that this is garbage. But when you look at nature, there is no garbage.
I agree.
So, and I think it's a wrong thinking. It's coming out of this linear stream, thinking that I make a raw material, I produce a good. After it's used, I throw it away. When I look at my parents or at my grandparents, it was a different way of thinking. I don't know whether you still knew your grandparents. I still knew my grandparents. They had a completely different way of looking at nature, at materials. As long as something was usable, it wasn't thrown away.
Absolutely.
And it wasn't replaced with something new. Why? It still worked. We had a garden bench standing outside. I think it was 80 years old, and it was painted over every year again. It was wooden, so make sure that it's not rotting. But nobody came with the idea we should buy a new one. Why? It's still working. Might look nicer, a new one, yes, but it's still working.
Yeah, and things were created that way as well to be more durable. The refrigerators would last way longer than all the FMCG kind of products.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think in many ways our modern society and the way how we use things has enabled people to live on a higher standard of living. The question is at what cost?
Yeah, I agree. Thank you, Stefan. This has been such an illuminating conversation for me personally. There is so much learning that has come from your thinking, and I do hope that we'll get to chat more because there is so much learning that comes from your very, very rich knowledge of the space. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Good Garbage podcast. Follow us on social media to never miss an episode. Links are in the description below. I'm your host, Ved Krishna. See you next time.